Imagine this. Let's say I have a superpower to put myself in your shoes, to understand your hopes, dreams, fears, and worries. And let's say I look through your calendar, I see how you order your time, what activities you prioritize in your free time, and what your mind defaults to when you wake up each morning, right before you fall asleep each night. Now the question is this: what would I find out about what you want for your life? A desire to earn enough to live comfortably? A longing to be loved? A yearning for significance, for your life to matter? Or maybe a deep nostalgia to return to the past, to relive those childhood days again? Or, if you're older, perhaps a visceral sense of the end that is near, and a desire to leave behind some sort of impact or legacy on your family, perhaps on others. Now hopefully this has stirred your imagination a little to think through this priceless primary question that I hope to cover in this video. What is it that you want for your life? Now at first glance, this question seems so simple it doesn't even need to be asked. Don't all people live for what they want? Doesn't capitalism teach us that if we want something and work hard enough, we probably will be able to get what we want? And isn't it embedded in our bones, our culture, our way of life? But if we are honest with ourselves and we take a closer look to really pause and get a hold of what's going on inside our hearts, we may find something quite different. See, most people that I know actually do not know what they want. And in some sense, that's actually very common, especially in a society like Singapore, where the prescribed routes to success tend to be narrower than those of other countries. People default to what culture tells them they should want. So for instance, for people who aren't clear about what they want, the chances of them pursuing a reasonably comfortable and luxurious lifestyle is pretty high. Now you might say, what's wrong with that? And that's a fair question. The issue here is not so much whether that lifestyle is good or bad in terms of moral judgment, but the point is that if you don't know what you want, you're probably going to be swept up by what culture tells you what you should want without you even knowing it. You look around and see your friends going on more holidays, choosing not to marry and have kids, joining a new golf hobby group, and naturally you follow it without giving it much thought, without actually asking yourself stringently, does this activity align with my own goals for my life, or does it not? And now we begin to see why more and more people are facing quarter life or midlife crisis, because they haven't actually worked out what they truly want for themselves. And even for those of us who vaguely know what we want, we may not be able to articulate it precisely, or over time, what we want may change as we go through life. Now the goal is not to be super precise about this, but at least to have a ballpark idea of what you want, and to be observant about how that desire changes or evolves over time. So for example, let's say I want to volunteer once a week to help the elderly or children, but over time, other commitments come in and crowd out my time. Now if I'm observant, then I'm able to say, okay, do I really want to continue pursuing this desire? If yes, then am I willing to give up these other commitments, to say no? So we don't need to know what we want exactly, but we do need to have a rough idea so that we can calibrate and recalibrate as life goes on and things like relationships, work, and other commitments press in on us. Now in fact, it's probably easier to articulate what we do not want. I don't want to work long hours for an unappreciative boss. I don't want to be like that relative who's gone through 3 divorces, so on and so forth. Now that's a helpful start, but it still doesn't help us necessarily understand what it is that we truly want deep down in our hearts. Now in view of all that I've said above, this question is one of exceedingly high importance. And if we are able to work through this question, to sit quietly with ourselves, to put aside the noise, and really figure out what is it that we truly want, I venture to say that our society will look a lot more different than what it currently is. and probably for the better. For one, our society will benefit greatly from people who have a deeper sense of meaning and purpose, and that will lead to much fulfillment and joy. Unfortunately, in today's Singapore and most developed countries, you see a lot of people working too hard, feeling too tired, and then going on a holiday to take a break, and then come home and need another holiday from that holiday because it was too packed. And the cycle goes on and on. So I would argue that fulfillment and joy comes not from more holidays or experiences, but from a deep sense of self-awareness, from which we live our lives intentionally. And so let's spend some time exploring this question today. In a separate video, I will share what I want for my life, how I got there using a set of tools and frameworks that I hope will be helpful for you, along with my thought process and key considerations that help me arrive at my own convictions. But for now, let's walk through the deceptive nuances around such a simple question. Well, for a start, if you ask yourself what you want, a few things will probably jump out. First, you probably have some short-term desires. I want to pass my exam, I want to get that pay rise, I want to go for a holiday in Taiwan. And that's a good place to start. But then the question is this: behind those more immediate desires, are there deeper desires, hidden or hiding within our inner subconscious, that if we ask ourselves and pause long enough, will rise to the surface? Probably, but also not always. Perhaps some of us don't have any outstanding desires, but we need the time and space to process our feelings and thoughts. And only after that, then maybe some desires may break forth to the surface. So in summary, we generally have two sets of desires: the immediate short-term goals that press to the surface more readily, and the deeper set-in desires that may take time, reflection, and contemplation to arrive at. Now these two are also likely related to each other. So for example, my desire to land a well-paying job may betray a deeper desire for security, because maybe my family didn't always have food on the table when I was growing up. Now in some sense, we may say that all of us have the same baseline needs or desires. For example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, things like food, water, safety, belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. But on the other hand, in a developed country like Singapore, where most basic needs like food, water, and safety are generally met, you will find that the pursuit of higher order needs can take a variety of forms, and for some people may take a lifetime and still remain unfulfilled. Now on top of that, when it comes to higher order desires, we actually have greater agency and choice as compared to more basic needs. So for example, you can have a big say in controlling how much the applause of others matters to you, and you can implement practices to reduce how much that affects you over time. But you don't have the same amount of control when it comes to food or water. You need it, or else you fall sick and die. And so in that sense, asking yourself, what do you want in a developed country like Singapore, is actually a lot harder than if you were poor and struggling to put food on the table. Now when we ask ourselves this question, at first glance it appears to be an open-ended question and we are free to answer it however we like. However, let me suggest that in general, there are some desires that are deemed more worthy to pursue and others less so. The simplest example of this relates to the moral dimension, for example, good and evil. So for example, if I want to kill Charlie Kirk, that probably isn't the best goal to pursue. And in fact, some of the most wretched people, think of dictators like Hitler, are crystal clear on what they want, which is probably a dreadful thing. So the goal here is not just to be clear or convicted about what we want. It's about measuring what we want against the general consensus or wisdom across the ages. That there are indeed some desires that people deem as more worthy. For instance, most people would generally agree that a rich man who uses his wealth for the poor would be considered a better person than a rich man who lives a luxurious, self-centered life with little regard for the poor. Now at this juncture, let me pause and do a quick recap. So far, we've discussed two items: immediate versus long-term, deeper desires and goals, and the fact that some goals are more worthy to pursue than others. So what's next? Well, I think a good way to start is by simply sitting down with yourself, taking out a piece of paper, and writing down what comes to your mind as you think about this question. Whether it's something you like or something you don't like and detest. Now the trouble is that most of us don't have the time to do something like this. Or we're very doubtful if we can even get any value or insight if we were to do so. We sit down, stare at the wall blankly for 10 minutes, and then go back to our Netflix movie. That I understand and relate to. And so what I found helpful is to take a module or pay for a framework to help us to work through this. Once you pay for something, you probably will take it a lot more seriously. So let me recommend two frameworks. The first is called the Self-Authoring Suite by Jordan Peterson, a famous psychology professor and clinical psychologist. This is a series of online writing programs that help you to understand your past, understand who you are today, your faults and your virtues, and plan for your future. It's priced at like 30 USD, and I'll leave the link in the description box below. Now the idea is that we are taught to write essays in schools, but nobody ever tells us to think carefully and write an essay about ourselves. And this suite provides a set of frameworks to help you do that. Now I haven't actually used it myself, but I'm familiar with Jordan Peterson and his school of thought, so I would recommend the content readily. Now on to my second recommendation, which is something I've actually gone through myself. Now this is a module offered by a local Bible college here in Singapore, and the module is titled Discerning Your Life. It's a paid module with like 5 to 10 classes, can be done online, and in each class you are given a set of ideas and frameworks to think through your life. So for example, I was tasked to draw my family tree, to observe any patterns about my past, to understand any potential baggage that I continue to bring into my relationships today. Or I was asked to complete paid personality tests that help me identify my strengths and lean heavily into them. So on and so forth, you get the idea. Now this course, although it comes from a Christian perspective, I found a lot of the content generally applicable whether or not you consider yourself a Christian. Now let's say you don't want to take any of these courses, then what next? Well, I think a good way to start is by listing down all the things that you dislike. Let's say I don't like the stress in Singapore, or I don't like my arrogant boss who orders me around, so on and so forth. Now the goal shouldn't just be to avoid these things, but really to just understand why we dislike these things, to just articulate what is it that we detest, and what we respect or admire about others. And then once we have that, we find ourselves in a much clearer state of mind to go on and define what is it we actually want. Now the next thing I found helpful is to give yourself a fixed period of time to conduct this experiment, you might say, and simply sit and observe your feelings, maybe every day at night or every week. Most of us don't have this space, and few of us actually do regular reflections or journaling. So what you can do is to sort of assign yourself a forced deadline, let's say 3 months, and by the end of the 3 months, you need to sort of journal and articulate what you like about your life as it is, what you dislike, and what you hope to change. So let me give you a simple example from my life. So I generally struggle with personal disciplines like exercise and quiet time with God in the past. And that would leave me with a sense of guilt and disappointment whenever I failed to do these things. But these are things that I really wanted to anchor my life upon. And after I decided that they were non-negotiables, I figured out ways to ensure that I'll be able to do these things every single day. So my quiet time used to take 30 minutes to an hour, and because I did Bible study, it was intellectually quite tiring, which meant that some days when I was tired, I simply didn't want to do it. And for exercise, I used to aim to exercise 2 to 3 times a week, but now I've changed that requirement to almost daily, but smaller, shorter bits of exercise so that I can actually achieve them. And so for me, I've observed that it's easiest to complete these things first thing in the morning rather than late at night where my motivation and discipline are at their weakest. And since I've got kids, I wake up at 6:30 a.m. each morning before they wake up, and the first thing I do is around 40 minutes of silent prayer and meditation on just several verses in the Bible. Now, in order to wake up at 6:30, I need to sleep by 11 or 11:30 latest. So my routine really starts from the night before. Now, after I finish my quiet time, I'll fetch the kids to school, and immediately after that, I exercise. And since I know I'm lazy, I've realized that over time, if I plan to do a 20 or 30-minute workout, chances are I may not be able to drum up the motivation to do it. So instead, I do a 10-minute strength workout that is very intense, but I'm almost always able to do it because it doesn't feel as daunting mentally. So these are just small, simple adjustments that I've made to ensure I always clock in these two things, by hook or by crook, to ensure that I'm able to do what I set out to do and overcome barriers like laziness and lack of discipline. Now, to conclude, let me leave you with a short little story. So years ago, there were two men sharing a small hospital room. Both of them were very ill, but only one of them was allowed to sit up by the window for an hour each day. So every afternoon when the nurse propped him up with pillows, he would look outside and describe what he saw. The park below, filled with children chasing each other through the grass, young couples strolling with ice cream in hand, and the sunset melting over the lake like liquid gold. The man in the other bed, who could see nothing from where he lay, listened in silence to this other man as he described these things. Now, in his mind, the words became pictures. He could almost feel the breeze, almost hear the laughter. Those stories became his reason to keep going, one day after another. Now, one morning, the nurse entered with her usual smile, but the man by the window had passed away in his sleep. The surviving man felt a deep ache of loss. And after a few days, he asked if he could be moved to the bed by the window. The nurse agreed and carefully shifted him over. When he finally gathered the strength to sit up and turn his head, he saw a blank white wall. Nothing more. For a long while, he stared at it. And then he began to weep, not out of anger, but from understanding. The beauty that he lived his life on had never been outside that window, but from this other man's imagination, passed on to him in love. Could it be that what we truly want might not be something distant or external, but instead lies hidden beneath the noise, the strivings, and the endless comparisons? Maybe it's not ultimately about accumulating more experiences, recognition, money, or status, but something that lies within the deepest recesses of our hearts, a desire waiting to be uncovered. If only we would give ourselves the space to sit and listen. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.